Hello, so I'm Kip Howe with Ginger Nuts and Horror, and I'm absolutely delighted to be joined by Stephen Volk for an interview.
Thank you.
Great to have you and discuss your fantastic Dark Masters Trilogy.
Thank you very much.
2 novellas and a novel. That's an unusual shape for a trilogy.
Yeah, well, it didn't. The third one was going to be a novella, but it kind of grew a bit. So.
Okay.
But I'm quite pleased that the kind of third act of the trilogy is slightly longer. It feels a bit more meaty, really, so it worked out well, I think, in the end.
Sure. If we could start by talking about Whitstable. So,
Sure.
Peter Cushing, a much loved, beloved icon of British horror cinema. How did you feel about writing about a guy like that and producing a fictional version of him?
You mean the intimidation value? I didn't really feel intimidated, simply because I think I just felt I had this idea, and I had quite a clear idea of what kind of person he was in his private life or real life, as opposed to obviously only his portrayals in the Hammer films and other films. I felt quite clear about how he came across on screen, but also a kind of enough of an idea to picture him living in Whitstable with his wife, and what kind of person he was, what kind of values he carried with him. Of course, I didn't want to convey a complete picture of him. He's very much a kind of fictional character. But part of the game of these semi-biographical kind of fictions was inventing a version of those characters that I could use in the stories I wanted to tell, really. Rather than, I didn't attempt to make a fully rounded biographical picture of them. You can get that from a biography, certainly an autobiography of which he wrote 2 volumes, I think. So I wasn't attempting to duplicate that. It was more, what kind of character did I want him to be in terms of the story.
Right, okay. Because it's also very much a study of grief and loss. You know, we come to him in his life at, probably its lowest point. How hard do you find it to write about when you're dealing with such raw emotions, and how do you sort of prepare yourself for producing that kind of work?
Well, the funny thing is, I think it's what you seek out, really, as I was going to say horror writer, but as a writer, you want a story that has a kind of depth of feeling as a kind of core of it, really. So I don't shirk from that, really. It's what I'm kind of trying to find, and trying to see how my characters cope with that kind of depth of feeling. And really, it's kind of lodestone, or the lodestar, I think the expression is, the one you want to follow rather than avoid, really, for me anyway.
Okay. And how do you feel Peter held up under the pressure?
Well, I think what's remarkable is that really the story to begin with wasn't about really Peter to an extent and his relationship with his career, but I found in writing the story that in a way it was a kind of answer to the fact that he kind of buckled mentally under the strain of the loss of his wife. And kind of, I think it's reported that he turned down all offers of work for some time, and then he seemed to turn a corner and really relaunch himself into almost accepting any work offer that's out there. So in retrospect, I could blag it and say that was my purpose, to explain this change of heart. But really it wasn't. That didn't occur to me till later, but it was quite neat that in my story, I think it does offer an explanation to how his faith in himself could have been reaffirmed by some story that we'll never know unless you read this.
Which you really should do, can I just say. Okay. If we can move on to talk about Leytonstone. So this one started life as a short story. Can you talk about that?
It was a short story. It was a short film that I wrote, actually, called Little H, which was written in screenplay format, and it was really based on, as you know, the anecdote that Alfred Hitchcock told very often about his young life when he was taken by his father in town of Leytonstone to the local police station and locked up in a cell overnight at the age of 6 or 7, absolutely terrified overnight, and then released obviously the next day. And his father said to him, now you know what happens to naughty little boys. And Hitchcock would often tell this, to great effect later in his life, but he always said that it inculcated a huge fear of policemen for the rest of his life, which you can see in his films very, very often, notably in Psycho, when Marion Crane is pulled up by the traffic cop in Psycho. His fear of policemen is palpable in that. And I thought this was a neat idea for a little story, and really the punchline of the original story was, Hitchcock's grocery shop above the title, above the shop when the little boy returns, you know. I wrote that and it was published, but I thought there was more to be found out about this little boy I'd kind of invented, really. Again, it's a mixture of research and invention. And I thought this little vignette, in a way, is either the beginning of a longer story or the end of a story that comes before. You know, it's either the climax of a story or the kind of teaser to another story. So, as usually happens with me, I mull that over for probably a couple of years before I actually figure out what the hell I'm thinking about. And then I sat down and really kind of made it up sequentially, which often doesn't happen with me, and it became then about his relationship with the other boys in his school, this very strict Catholic school, the priests, the policeman became increasingly kind of a mysterious figure of evil, really, that young Fred becomes paranoid about, that thinks the policeman is still spying on him, that kind of thing. So it became about the central idea of being in the police cell became an event, a traumatic event in his childhood, which I then really explored the repercussions of that in terms of the young Fred's life in school and with his family. And I wanted to explore his family life, really. I took huge liberties, though, in such as not giving him any siblings, which he had in life. So he's an only child in my version, which is a terrible monstrosity of inaccuracy when you think about it. But I just wanted to hone it down to the simplest possible way to tell a story of a little boy who is traumatized, that kind of goes on to be the master of terror later in life and becomes the master of suspense and terror and really has a career frightening people.
Yeah, I mean, there's a wider point there. One of the themes across all three is themes of psychological damage and often childhood trauma, and how those end up, becoming embedded in the psyches of people who go on to become tellers of horrific tales.
That's absolutely true. Yeah. That wasn't really conscious until I saw the theme going through the first two stories. I didn't kind of bend it to fit the third story, but I just find that it's the way my mind works in order to find a character that I'm interested in. I couldn't write, for instance, Dennis Wheatley as a straightforward, kind of heroic, kind of Bruce Willis kind of hero with absolutely no depth whatsoever.
Sure.
Because to me those kind of stories have no value because they've got no struggle and no kind of hurt in them, no emotional kind of growth in them. They might be fun, but they're not the kind of characters that I'm interested in writing. For me, it has to be someone with a kind of flaw, that they have to face up to something kind of broken within themselves and go on a journey to either coming to terms with it or not coming to terms with it. That's kind of what I'm interested in characters, and I suppose I kind of found fictionally or factually that in the characters that I'm writing about in this trilogy.
So, as we're talking about Netherwood then, it's a very interesting 2-for-1.
Yes,
we've actually
I thought that would be, that's a kind of, not a gimmick, but a kind of surprise in the third one, that you've got two Dark Masters of different kind. So I like the idea of kind of, twisting the knife a little bit for the reader.
How early in the process did you know that you were going to use both Wheatley and Crowley together?
Well, people said, who's the third one going to be in the trilogy, and they suggested Lon Chaney Jr. or Boris Karloff, all these people who've got interesting lives, but I didn't really want to do another actor, and I didn't want to do another director. So I thought I wanted to keep in the creative world, but I was thinking about who else would fit but not be a predictable third, story. And I was thinking about Aleister Crowley being a magician, not really, I mean, he did write fiction, but not known particularly for writing fiction. But I didn't feel like I could get a handle on writing from his point of view. I mean, it's not a first-person narrative. The first two are not first-person narratives, but they are kind of from the point of view of those characters. But to write from the point of view of a kind of Victorian, a person brought up in Victorian Edwardian era, who heads a cult, who is a seductress, who is a seducer rather, and who has a malicious influence on people, who is very esoterically trained, and has illusions of creating his own Crowleyanity. I thought, there's no way I can kind of get my head around what makes him tick. And increasingly when I read about him, I thought he's kind of an elusive kind of trickster character. who is a kind of what they call, when we do, you know, in the script world, they talk about catalytic characters that have an effect on other ones or make the protagonist behave in a certain way. So not the protagonist, but the catalytic character that goes with it. And I thought that's the way to use him. And then through various things, I thought the character I want to write the point of view of is Dennis Wheatley, who I know had met Aleister Crowley when he was researching The Devil Rides Out in the early 30s, and probably met him a few times with his wife and that kind of thing. Said he was good company and that kind of thing. A lot of detail known about that famous lunch that they had together.
Well, there is now.
There is now. I think every fragment of detail I put in there, and made up a few as well about what wines they had and everything. But I enjoyed doing those kind of little sort of nods towards flashback. But really my invention was the idea that Aleister Crowley asks for Dennis's help when he's nearing the end of his life and he's faced with a very much darker force that he can't defeat in Hastings in 1947, that they have to kind of battle it together. So you have these two completely opposite men, Dennis Wheatley and Aleister Crowley, one hedonistic, heretical, you know, everything anarchic that can be imagined about a human being, sexist, manipulative, and poor old Dennis, who is a kind of more a straight down the line kind of Christian British values, you know, worked in military intelligence during the war, you know, patriotic, loves his wife, got a good family, rich and famous, novelist and successful, you know, so massive contrast between the two people, and I just relished the opportunity of putting them together and see what would happen, really.
Sure. I mean, you've already talked about it a bit, but I imagine researching Crowley must have been very difficult because he's someone who's so many stories and myths have accrued around him.
Well, once you read 3 or 4 or 5 biographies, you realise that everyone has a different viewpoint,
right?
And you have to kind of sift through the viewpoint of the person writing the book to the basic facts, you know. And I always approach research on the basis that read as much as you can before it gets boring. In other words, when you get to the point where you're reading a book and you're skipping through it because it's really factual information you already know, then that's probably the point to set that book aside and say, right, I'm going to start writing. Because you don't want to lose the energy of writing your fictional version of Crowley. Again, as I said with Peter Cushing, I'm not writing an absolute version. I was going to say gospel, that would be a bit kind of blasphemous to say that, a version of Crowley. Sure. It's kind of my fictional version that operates for my story. The same with Dennis Wheatley. It's not a rounded portrait, it's the character he needs to be for my story to work, really.
Okay, so how much does that research methodology apply to the sense of time? Because each of these stories are set in a very distinct time period, and that the time period is almost a character in its own right, I felt.
I love that aspect, actually, because, I mean, I didn't want to have a massive kind of modernist approach to them being written in different ways, other than the Hitchcock story I tell in the present tense, simply because I think it has a slightly more filmic quality when you read it, because screenplays, as you know, are written in the present tense. Yeah. So I think almost subtextually or unconsciously, I think a present tense story feels a bit more like a film than you know, past tense. So that was a kind of nod, but I didn't want to do it in screenplay form, for instance. That would have been a bit too kind of arch.
Sure.
And I didn't want to write the third one as if Dennis Wheatley is writing it. Okay. Partly because I think that is a massive kind of difficult ask on top of just getting the story right, and I might fail kind of miserably. But the other awful thing would be I might succeed in imitating his prose, and I might have something that's a bit kind of concrete and turgid. So I wanted to nod to it feeling like a period in 1940s, kind of could have been written in the 1940s, but it's very much me writing from today in terms of my preoccupations. But I like, back to your thing about the time scale, I love reading around that period. You know, I looked at films. I thought about films that I like Brighton Rock or The Third Man. You know, the scene going up the elevated lift in Hastings is very much like the scene on the wheel in The Third Man, you know, where they look down and he says about the tiny insignificant people. That's a complete lift from it, you know. So I kind of wanted to make, it doesn't matter really to me whether people pick up on all those things. And, you know, books like Patrick Hamilton's Hangover Square, you know, that kind of idea of, you know, slightly before the war, slightly after the war. As I was writing it, I got very much the impression that, or the impression went into the story very much of Britain recovering from the war. And in a way, that was much more fruitful in terms of atmosphere than had it been set in the war. You know, I had to write it in 1947 because that's when Crowley died, and I wanted it immediately before he died, really, for plot purposes. But in the end, it turned out to be very interesting, kind of in terms of the visuals and in terms of, you know, this kind of wounded country, really.
Yeah, I was going to say, I mean, that's the feeling. It's very much like it's actually too soon for recovery. The trauma is still rippling out, really, in a lot of ways.
Yeah. Well, I was born 1954, so you know, I think I was you know, 5 or 6 towards the end of the 50s. And I can remember growing up with kind of commando comics in which, you know, British soldiers were still shooting the Hun and things like this, or, you know, and Japanese soldiers were being shot by US Marines in these little comics, and all the comics were full of war stories, you know what I mean?
Sure.
And it was still a kind of post-war feeling even in the late 50s that I can remember, you know, and I picked up on a couple of little incidentals about that, which I put in. You know, there's a little chalk drawing of a character called Chad, which used to be popular during the war, and used to say, "What, no potatoes?" or "What, no sausages?" You know, that kind of thing. And another story was one my mother told me about, because she used to live up in Merthyr during the war, and the library was bombed, and the books exploded and kind of rained down across the street, you know. And that was an image I thought was kind of belonged in this trilogy, really. So I felt that had to be in there.
Yeah. So the theme of all 3 stories is about creators of dark tales facing real life evil. I wondered if you could talk a bit about what is about that theme that's so interested you that you've now written 3 fairly meaty stories on the subject.
Yeah, I didn't think it would be a trilogy with that common thread, really. When I started the Whitstable one, it became more to me. Well, first of all, it was writing a story about Cushing meeting the little boy and wanting to help him, and that kind of thing. The little boy that believes in vampires, that kind of thing, and he thinks that Cushing is Van Helsing. But as I was writing on it more and more, I became interested in the idea that I was writing about Peter Cushing as a way of writing about my feelings about the horror genre.
Okay.
And you know how the horror genre is disparaged and sneered at by, you know, normal people. And I've always felt it's you know, been a great boon to my life, you know, both reading it and working in it. And I just think it's a great life-enhancing force, really. Complete opposite of what the general public think. And I realised that in the writing of the first one, I think that's what I was going to explore, is what really what I felt about horror, by firstly writing about Peter Cushing, by writing about Alfred Hitchcock, someone who through trauma was had a whole career about terrifying people. Why did he want to why does anyone want a career terrifying people? And kind of like that's what I do as a profession, terrifying people. I mean, I like other things as well.
Sure.
But if you're a terror writer, that's what you're kind of known for, and people are bemused and befuddled by that, you know. And I thought, well, what is the answer to that question? I don't know the answer. I can't write a thesis about it or get a PhD about it, but I can write some stories about it. And I think that extends into the third one, which is specifically about a writer who writes black magic stories about horror, about shocking people, you know, and creating bestsellers that attract huge audiences for, you could say, titillation, you could say for shock horror or whatever you want to call it, and has maybe an ambivalent attitude towards why he does that, or doesn't maybe examine why he does that. So what is the reason he does deep down in his soul, in his morality, what causes him to do that? And I had to answer that actually before I could write Netherwood. Even though that story, that question does not have an answer probably in real life. In order to make him a fictional character, I have to know what deep down makes him write black magic stories. And to me, the answer was that he fears black magic and Satanism because, in the same way that he fears communism, because they're a threat to his values. And his values are quite fragile. His values are patriotism, Britishness, Christianity, and marriage, if you like, and all those things he holds dear. He feels that Satanism is one of these things that is lurking under the surface to blow it all apart, really. And then I felt I could write the story once that was at the core of him. And in some ways, it's also an emblem of sex, in a way, being threatened by sex and sexual activity, and that's what Crowley represents to him as well, is unabandoned promiscuity, selfish promiscuity, rather than responsibility, and Dennis would say love, probably.
Sure. As
Peter Cushing says love. So that's another kind of rhyming idea that goes through all three stories in a way.
Interesting as you were saying that, I was thinking about how also the fact that, again, we talked about the post-war collapse, that seems to feed very much into those anxieties of Wheatley's, because the empire is starting to crumble.
It is threatened, yeah.
So a lot of the things he holds dear are actually starting to fall apart before his very eyes.
Yeah.
That's fascinating. I have one question I have to ask you before we finish, which I got from Johnny Mains, who I told I was doing this interview. He said, "Oh, you must ask Stephen this."
Oh yeah, go on.
So, if you could meet each of your Dark Masters and ask them one question each,
oh my gosh,
what question would you ask of each of the Dark Masters? Starting with Peter, I guess.
Gosh. Oh my gosh, I should have thought about that.
We got him, Johnny.
I think the only thing that springs to mind, and I probably will think of a better answer when I've been given a couple of seconds thought, is you do inevitably think, what would they make of the world today?
Okay.
And I don't really know what the answer to those ones is. I can try and think about it now. Dennis would be probably outraged at the general state of the world, because I think he didn't like hippies, he didn't like anything liberal or that kind of thing. The loosening of morals would probably appall him. If he, God help us if he watched Channel 4. Hitchcock probably rather differently. I think when you think about Frenzy, the film he made towards the end of his life, I think he actually could have, if he had infinite lifespan, or at least another 10 years, I think he would have ridden out the kind of permissive society and become a different filmmaker, where he could be more explicit in what his aims were. Part of what we love about his films is they're never explicit really about sex, about relationships, that kind of thing. We read into them because they're about those things on a voyeurism and sexual attraction and obsession on a level that he could get away with, which is a poetic level. But had he been, had the door open to him being able to be more explicit about that, he certainly would have made more explicit sex in his films, I think, and that might have been really quite interesting. It might have been completely wrong. A little bit like reinventing carry-on films in the age where you don't need innuendo anymore.
Right.
You have people using all sorts of language for comedy, and the carry-on films innuendo is completely out of date, so you don't know. Peter Cushing, I think, I don't know how he would react. The horror films being today, I think he would find appallingly extreme. His view of horror, of course, was that they were like medieval mystery plays of good against evil, and that he was in a kind of fantasy world with a lot of the horror he was doing. Of course, that didn't apply to all those films. You have to look at them. Some of them are quite, a film like Corruption is quite sadistic, that kind of thing. But what would I ask? I could only think about how they would be in the present day, really. I can't think what I would ask them. I would ask them what would they do, if I would ask Dennis Wheatley how would Hitchcock have cast The Devil Rides Out if he made it in the 1940s, which is something that I suggest in my book, and I had fun playing around with the idea it might have been made in the 1940s. But there are probably too many questions to that I'd have to have a long, hard think about it, and maybe I'll put them online when I've thought about them a bit more.
That'd be great. Well,
Sorry about that.
No, that's fine. It was a brutal question to end on. Well, Stephen, thanks so much for sitting down and chatting with us today. I really appreciate it. And this is as I said in my review, this is a remarkable achievement, and you should be very proud indeed of it. And thank you so much to PS Publishing for all the technical side of making this happen. We really appreciate you helping us do this interview today. Thank you very much indeed.
And thanks to Ginger Nuts of Horror and yourself for being such a support. I really appreciate it.
You keep writing and we'll keep reviewing them, man.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Cheers.